Thank you, John. Well, thank you, John. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for this invitation to come and speak with you this morning. Genuinely, I'm incredibly excited to spend the next few days with you folks. I'm flattered, I'm honored, but there's also a very healthy dose of unworthiness in my attitude, especially being considered an inspiring alumni. I mean, if you think about some of our alumni, I mean, there's people who have skied to the South Pole. There's people who've been on the summit of Everest. There's people who've been down to the bottoms of the ocean. We have people who are astronauts. And so I kind of look at my accomplishments and say, okay, what have I done? I've started a service that'll let you stay awake for 48 hours binging 8 seasons of Lost in a row. I just want to put things in perspective. There is, however, kind of a nice symmetry in having me speak. We have Timmy O'Neill coming in tomorrow night, who has spent most of his life in the mountains. And you'll start off this morning hearing from someone who spent most of their life in a valley, which is, of course, Silicon Valley. And we'll talk a bit about that today, because I actually think, although that may be an alien environment to many of you, having spent 30 some odd years learning how to kind of survive in that jungle, realized there's actually a tremendous amount to learn there. I've learned how much of an education NOLS was for me and helped me be successful there. But I also really have come to believe that there's a lot of lessons that Silicon Valley can bring us, that NOLS can actually benefit from learning how to think like a startup. But before we go to the Valley, I want to talk for a moment about another place which is equally alien, which most people in the world have never been to. It's really hard to get to. It's hard for people to understand why you'd even want to go there. And of course, you know I'm speaking about Lander. It truly is one of my favorite places in the world. I first came to Lander in 1972, so almost 45 years ago. I was 14 years old. My parents put me on a Greyhound bus from New York City, and I got off the bus in front of the Noble, and I walked in, and all I could wonder was, what were they thinking? The whole thing was new to me. I remember walking down Main Street. I went into Joe's Place, I think it's called, and I bought myself a cowboy hat, because I figured, well, that's Wyoming, you know. So I was a little bit discouraged when the next morning when I went to get issued, and they gently discouraged me from bringing the cowboy hat. And they gave me instead this thing which was basically a sock, which I had to wear on my head. That was the intro to that special brand of NOLS clothing. But there was more surprises in store. I remember that first time I crested a pass, and for the first time saw what the Rockies were really about, that grandeur, that size and scale, which was so unlike anything I'd ever experienced back east. I remember catching my first fish. I remember cooking and burning my first meal, the first food I'd ever really prepared for myself. And I remember that incredible feeling of blurry and weak confidence that I'd gotten from 4 days of survival, that I'd survived on little more than mountain sorrel and grouse whortleberries. And unfortunately, I remember very clearly throwing up on the sidewalk outside of Mr. D's supermarket when I had made the perhaps not a good choice that the best way to break that 4-day fast was with a box of donuts, a bag of Fritos, and a liter of Coke. Nonetheless, I was hooked. And I was back at NOLS the very next summer, and there was plenty more to learn. One day, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks into the course, we had this brutal day. We had camped that night before up at Grave Lake, right below Mount Hooker, and then spent that whole day kind of working our way south along the divide and then 2,000 feet up and over the pass, and then down to a campsite on the East Fork. And we were whipped, and we were just kind of sitting there barely recovering, and then the I-team kind of strides in as if it's nothing. And the course leader, young man named Bill Murdoch, comes up to me and says, Mr. Randolph, do you know what you're doing tomorrow? And I shook my head. And he said, well, I'll tell you what. You're going back to Grave Lake to clean up that campsite. And so I did, by myself. 6 miles each way, 2,000 feet twice, to do little more than pick up a baggie with some moleskin backing, some uncooked macaroni, and some pieces of string. And I was 15 years old, but I think that was the moment when someone finally forced me to take responsibility for my own actions. And Murdoch wasn't done with me yet. It was a week later. It was another beautiful blue Wind River day, and I decided this is perfect. I'm just going to leave my sleeping bag out to dry while we go around the lake for a climbing camp. And as we all began walking out of camp, I could see Murdoch looking at the sleeping bag with that little kind of sly smile on his face, which I didn't even realize the meaning of that till much later. And of course, the weather came in. And I won't need to tell you, of course, the outcome to that story, but I'll just point out that that is a lesson you do not need to learn more than once. The very next year, I came back again as a student, this time for a climbing course. The summer after that, I was up in the North Cascades for mountaineering. And then back to the Tetons for both the summer and a winter instructor's course. And that kicked off 4 amazing years of working for the school. And after that, I didn't see the winds for 25 years. I got married, I raised a family, put 3 kids through their NOLS courses, and spent most of my time starting and growing a handful of startups. Now, people think that starting a company some ways is like climbing a mountain. But I've got to say, that's actually a pretty weak analogy. Because when you climb a mountain, for the most part, you can see the mountain. You have maps. You have a rough idea where the route's going to take you. You know where the top is, and it's pretty clear to you whether you've actually made the top or not. See, to me, I think starting a company is more like searching for the lost city of Atlantis, where you're not quite sure where it is, you're not quite sure how to get there. In fact, you're not even really quite sure it exists at all. And then, on the way, there's all kinds of adventures that you never expected. So I'm going to fast forward us to 1996. I was working on, I think, my 5th startup. It was a small company. There was 2 co-founders and I. We had 6 employees, so 9 of us in total. And we were laboring in happy obscurity on a really geeky software product, which we hadn't even released yet. And then this wonderful thing happened. We were acquired by a big, even geekier software company. Now, in Silicon Valley, that's a great outcome because the investors make money, you have stock options, and all of a sudden they're worth money, and then we all got jobs at this big, geeky software company. And I went to work there, and I did that happily for 6 to 8 months, and then lightning struck again. Our big software company was acquired by an even bigger software company. Once again, great news, the investors made even more money, our stock options were worth even more. But the best thing that happened is I got fired. But I didn't get fired in that kind of walk of shame, carrying a box with your tape dispenser and your personal effects out to the car. I got fired in that wonderful Silicon Valley kind of golden handcuffs kind of way, where they bring you into the office and they go, Mr. Randolph, due to redundancies and duplications in force and blah, 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 we're no longer going to need your services, but we'd like you to stick around for maybe 6 months in case we have questions or anything comes up. And I kind of zone out at this point. And then I kind of grasp what they're saying. And I go, so you need me to come to work for about 6 months, and you're going to keep paying me, and you'll keep vesting my stock, Yeah. And I'll still have my office with my fast internet connection and my whiteboard and my conference table. Yep. But I won't have anything to do. And they go, well, I guess you could put it that way. And I said, well, sign me up. I said, I'm going to spend the next 6 months starting my next company. But I had to find an idea. And contrary to popular belief, ideas don't count for anything. Ideas are cheap. Everyone's got ideas. There's thousands of them, and most of them suck. So what you've got to do is go through lots and lots and lots and lots of ideas and do quick testing and iteration and thinking about them to figure out if they're any good. And I had a friend who also lived in Santa Cruz, California with me, and we used to commute together over to work, over the Santa Cruz Mountains, about an hour drive. And we decided we were going to figure out the next company to start. And we began brainstorming ideas on this hour commute back and forth. Literally hundreds of ideas. And each day I'd go into my office and I'd use my fast internet connection and my whiteboard and I'd do all this research. And most of them were bad ideas. And one of the ideas was we should try and do video rental by mail. Big category. So I went in and began researching it, and it turned out to be a bad idea. Because, I mean, by the look of you, most of you probably were just watching Lion King back then. But video used to come on video cassettes, those big, heavy, expensive, fragile things. And that was not going to work for video rental by mail. So, bad idea, on to the next. And then about 2 months later, Reed Hastings, who was my partner in all this, got in the car one morning and told me about this new technology called a DVD. Small and thin, whole movie would fit on it, the size of a music CD. And that kind of gave us a new idea. So we turned the car around and drove back down to Santa Cruz and went to a music store and bought a used music CD, then walked 2 doors down to a stationery shop and bought a little pink gift envelope, the type you put a greeting card in, put the CD in the envelope, sealed it up, addressed it to Reed's house in Santa Cruz, went to the Santa Cruz post office and dropped it in the slot, and then went to work. And the very next day, when Reed came to pick me up, he didn't even say anything. He just held up this little envelope with an unbroken CD that had gotten to his house in less than 24 hours for the price of a first-class stamp. And that was kind of the moment we said, this might change some things. And that became the genesis for this next new venture. And then I plunged into a whole different mode of research. I was really trying to plan this expedition. I was trying to find out everything I could. How many DVD players have been sold? How many DVDs are they? What do they cost? How long is this going to take? How big of a warehouse? What's the path going to look like? What are the conditions? What kind of equipment are we going to need? How big of a team? Am I going to have enough resources to make me all the way there? And as I kind of went through this process, as we finally got to the point on April 14th, 1998, where we finally launched Netflix, I realized, wow, almost everything that I've done for the last 6 months, in fact, everything I've done for the last 20 years, I think I learned this at NOLS. All this setting off into the unknown with prior preparation, with tolerance for adversity, I've done this before. And in fact, I've found it's remarkable how similar it is leading a startup to leading a group into the woods or down a river or any place that requires uncertainty. I mean, for one thing, you've got to be prepared to make decisions and base these decisions on information which is completely uncertain or ambivalent or contradictory. You've got to communicate, here's where we're going, with confidence and clarity, even if you, quite frankly, have no idea exactly where you're going yourself. You've got to build a team. You've got to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses. You've got to encourage diversity of skills and opinions. You've got to take risks. You've got to set hard goals. You have to fight to overcome them. You've got to tolerate adversity. You have to be flexible. But the amazing thing is that when I started this company, I said to myself, it feels like I've been doing this my whole life, because I had. Because NOLS figured out how to teach me these things starting when I was 14. At that point, of course, it was pretty baby steps. But little by little, with each leader of the day, with each successive course, with each course I taught first as an instructor, then as a PL, and then as a CL, it was layering on deeper and deeper and more nuanced levels of leadership. That by the time it came time to do the same thing in Silicon Valley, piece of cake. Now, I really believe that the world can learn a lot from NOLS about entrepreneurship, about leadership. But as I said before, I think NOLS could actually benefit a lot from the things we've learned in Silicon Valley. How to think like a startup. Now, at this point, you're probably kind of going, I don't quite get it. What is it that NOLS can learn from startups? What is it that the leading player in the field, with decades of experience, the 800-pound gorilla in the space, what can they possibly learn from a 2-year-old startup, wet behind the ears, run by 20-somethings? Well, to give you an example of why there might be something that NOLS could learn there, I'm going to tell you a story about another favorite place. And this favorite place is perhaps even more surprising than Lander, especially for someone from California. This other favorite place is actually, God, I hate to admit it, Dallas, Texas. I know. You very rarely hear someone from California tell you their favorite place is Dallas, Texas. And believe me, it's not for the culture or the climate. It's because Dallas, Texas was the headquarters of Blockbuster. And more importantly, that a meeting with Blockbuster took place in the year 2000, which ended up being a big turning point in my life. Now, in the year 2000, Netflix was in a totally different place than it is today. For one, we were tiny. We had less than 100 employees. We were on track to maybe do $3 million in sales that year. But unfortunately, we had accumulated losses at that point of nearly $50 million. Big number. And especially in the year 2000, when the markets were not especially conducive to lending someone more money when they were already 50 million in the hole. So, being prudent entrepreneurs, we did that thing that prudent entrepreneurs do when their back is against the wall. They pursue strategic alternatives, which is code for how do we dump this sucker. Now, the obvious strategic alternative for us was Blockbuster. But in the year 2000, Blockbuster was in a totally different place. So we had 100 employees. Blockbuster had 60,000 employees. We were on track. We were on track to do 3 million in sales. They were on track to do 6 billion in sales. We had one little warehouse. They had 9,000 stores. We were like nothing to them. So of course, when we called them, try and get a meeting, we emailed them, tried to reach them with go-betweens, nothing. Crickets. So on with our life. And a few months later, in September of the year 2000, we were at a corporate retreat, and we were at the Alisal Ranch. I'm not sure anyone's heard of this. It's a little dude ranch in the foothills outside of Santa Barbara, California. And NOLS is a very casual place, and Silicon Valley is a very casual place. So when you go on retreat and you want to be even more casual, you kind of have to work at it. And so we were on retreat, and I had brought with me flip-flops, shorts, and the only thing I had up top was 2 tank top t-shirts. And just to get myself in the spirit of casualness, I'd actually gone out and gotten a henna Harley-Davidson tattoo. And of course, this is when Blockbuster calls and says, "We will see you tomorrow in Dallas." And we're going, shit. because Santa Barbara, the Alisal Ranch is about as hard to get to as this is. And so we go, how are we going to get to Dallas by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning? So we did the prudent thing that a company who's $50 million in the hole would do. We leased a private jet. 50 million, 10,000, rounding error. We all pile in, we all fly to Dallas. We go up to the 28th floor, whatever it is, some huge skyscraper. We go into this conference room, which I swear was about the size of this room. This huge conference room made out of some kind of endangered hardwood, no doubt. And don't forget, I'm there, I swear to God, I'm there in flip-flops, shorts, and a tank top t-shirt with a Harley Davidson tattoo. And my partner, Reed, I remember I was jealous because he had on a Hawaiian shirt. So he had buttons. Anyway, the Blockbuster guys come in, and we make our pitch that we'll join forces, that we'll do the online part of the business, they'll run the stores, we'll find those elusive synergies, and we'll go on happily ever after. And they kind of nod their heads in the right places, and then they ask the big question, which is, how much should we pay for you? And Reed kind of screws up his courage and goes, $50 million? The hubris that we would ask for $50 million for this little dinky e-commerce website. And the meeting went downhill very quickly after that. And we slunk back with our tails between our legs to the plane, and it was this long, quiet ride back home. But I very genuinely remember sitting there on the plane, my head down, thinking to myself, oh, now we're going to have to kick their ass. And it did. It took us 10 years. But eventually we did, and eventually we drove them out of business. And I'm not bragging here. But in some ways, I tell that story because it's an inspiring story, because when we started Netflix, we had no video experience. And the fact that a handful of people with no video experience could take down this market leader with decades of experience, this 800-pound gorilla, was amazing. But it's a different story, kind of, isn't it, if you're that market-leading company and you have the decades of experience and you're the 800-pound gorilla. Because then it says something very different. It says that the people who may be coming after you may look nothing like you. And that when they come after you, they're not going to come after you and come after you doing the things that you were already doing great at. They're going to come after you doing something you're not doing, or you can't do, or you won't do, or you're scared to do. What it says is that if you can't learn how to disrupt yourself, you're leaving it wide open for someone to disrupt you for you. Now, obviously, this is not an existential threat to NOLS. We are in a great, great position. I mean, we are the leader in wilderness education. We have tremendous student outcomes. We have an amazing safety record. We're in a strong financial position. We have growing net assets. We've got a strong balance sheet. We've got a big endowment. We're getting more and more students. We're setting records each year in students and student days. And we're blessed with amazing people, both in the classroom and the field, but in the branches, in headquarters. We have all these strengths. But the world is changing. And we all laugh at the way that Bill Murdoch, 45 years ago, chose to teach me personal responsibility. Because we would never do that to a student these days. Right, Drew? We laugh at the fact that we used to wear funny hats and carry Optimus and Svea stoves, and we went out with double sweaters and Army surplus wool pants and full shank climbing boots on backpacking courses. And we would never send students out outfitted like that, because we've recognized that things change. There's new techniques, there's new equipment. But the changes that we're seeing today are different. They're not changes in equipment. They're not changes in technique. They're different changes. And these changes are coming faster than they've ever come before. So whereas before, back when I was a lad, Outward Bound and NOLS were the only games in town. But now, you all can see there are dozens and dozens of new programs that are all competing to get people out into the outdoors. They're all competing for the same time. And whereas before, students thought nothing of spending 30 days in the heart of the summer, now they're trying to shoehorn in 4, 5, or 6 different experiences into a single summer. And it's a summer that's getting shortened as the school year now is expanding on both ends. Whereas before, people chose these courses using that well-thumbed catalog, now they're choosing it with, tweets and snaps and Facebook likes and YouTube videos. And before, virtually all of our students were getting that transformative 30-day and longer wilderness experience. Now fully 80% of our students spend less than 7 days in the backcountry. And 60% spend no time at all there. So how do you react to that? How do you respond? And primarily, you have to recognize that we're going to have to do things a little bit differently. That things that have worked in the past may not be the same things that work in the future. That we're not going to be able to just do the same things we've always done, but do them harder. It's going to require thinking differently and trying things we haven't done. Now, on the one hand, this should be easy. We're risk takers, right? But one of our advertising agencies last summer pointed out to us that we're risk takers in the field, but we're a little more comfortable in town. So how do we take that spirit of risk-taking? How do we take that spirit of entrepreneurship, of trying new things, and apply it to all of our problems? How do we learn to think like a startup? What does it mean to think like a startup? Well, once we launched Netflix back on April 14th, 1998, we had a pretty clear idea of where we were going to go. We were going to be a video online rental store. But the innovation kind of stopped there, because although we did mail discs and then have them get mailed back to us, we had due dates, we had late fees, we had the same catalog as everybody. There was really nothing special about it. And it didn't take us long to realize that this business model had a particular problem. And that particular problem was the customers. They hated it. In fact, we couldn't get customers. And if we managed to convince one person to do it, it was almost impossible to get them to come back and try it again. So, necessity being the mother of invention, we said we have got to figure out some new approaches. We've got to try testing something totally new. And so we began to build our first tests. And I'm kind of an OCD kind of guy. So at first, these tests were works of art. We would do custom photography, and we would spend days lovingly crafting the copy, spell-checked and arguing about word choice. We would test every single link. We would stress test the site. And then, a month later, we'd launch this test, and it would fail. And we'd kind of post-mortem and say, we just wasted a month. All right, we got to go a bit faster. I'll cut a few corners. And we'd do a test in 2 weeks, and it would fail again. And we'd say, crap, we wasted 2 weeks. Faster. And we did a test a week. And then faster. We could do 2 tests a week. And then pretty soon we were doing 5 tests a week. And then pretty soon we got to the point we could test 3 or 4 concepts in a single day. Now, as you can imagine, things are getting a little sloppy. We're starting to put up images and forget that we've left the watermark on them, or they're the wrong images, or we have spelling errors and typos. We have pages that are going in the wrong order. We're crashing the site. We have links that go nowhere. It was a disaster, but it turned out it didn't make a difference. Because if it was a bad idea, that no matter how perfectly we crafted this test, it was still a bad idea. But if it was a good idea, then even though it was poorly done, even though the site would crash and the links were broken, customers would fight to do this new thing. They'd call us, they'd email us, they'd reboot the site over and over again, and it was this bright, shining light that of all the 100 things we'd tried, that was the one that we needed to fix. It turns out that success is not about having this single good idea and planning it start to finish and then rolling it out. Success is proportionate to how many ideas you can try. And the number of ideas you try is directly proportionate to how quickly and easily and painlessly you can try them. And that once you've figured out how to take ideas and quickly and painfully and easily try them without impacting other things, that's when the spirit of true innovation kind of really takes off. But being a NOLSy, I kind of know this is not going to come naturally to us. To start, and don't deny this, we do tend to think that there's a NOLS way. And so, our iterations tend to be just slight variations on a proven theme. But there's actually a more fundamental reason why I think we get hung up sometimes on trying things, and it's an extremely valid one. You have to be extremely careful about your testing, about the things you try. When you have true student impact, we are operating in areas where risk is an inherent part of them. We have people's lives in our hands. So how do you balance those two things? This desire to test, but the desire to keep people safe. Now, Jeff Bezos, who's the founder and CEO of Amazon, wrote in the most recent letter to shareholders about this exact topic, he calls it fast and slow decision making. And I thought it applied so perfectly to the type of conflicts we have at NOLS that if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to read you a little piece of it. One common pitfall for large organizations, he writes, one that hurts speed and inventiveness is one-size-fits-all decision-making. Some decisions are consequential and irreversible, or nearly irreversible. They're one-way doors. And these decisions must be made methodically, carefully, slowly, with great deliberation and consultation. If you walk through and don't like what you see on the other side, you can't get back to where you were before. We can call these one-way door decisions. But most decisions aren't like that. They're changeable, reversible. They're two-way doors. If you've made a suboptimal two-way door decision, you don't have to live with the consequences for that long. You can reopen the door and go back through. Two-way door decisions can and should be made quickly by high-judgment individuals or small groups. As organizations get larger, there seems to be a tendency to use the heavyweight, one-way decision-making process on most decisions, including many two-way decisions. And the end result of this is slowness, unthoughtful risk aversion, failure to experiment sufficiently, and consequently diminished invention. He's talking about Amazon. But when we consider the challenges that NOLS faces, and look at these challenges through that lens of fast and slow decision-making, there's a lot we can use. Now, certainly all of us can think of plenty of areas that require we use the more deliberative one-way door decision-making. Anything which impacts the health and welfare of our students. Things that make us less capable of preventing or responding to incidents. Things which impact the richness of our student outcomes. But we're doing ourselves a grave disservice if we treat all decisions using one-way door decision-making techniques. Because we insist on mapping out every possible outcome to its ultimate conclusion if we insist on knowing the entire route, even though we can't see around that first bend before we start, then the consequences are obvious. Our progress is tentative, or worse, we don't start at all. Now, I hope you don't think that I'm being harsh on NOLS, because it really is quite the contrary, because I love this place. I mean, I love what it's done for me, and I love what it's done for my children, and I love what I've seen it do for the thousands, the tens of thousands, the 100,000 graduates who came before me, not before me, who've come since me. Damn, I'm old. Anyway, I do love this place. And it's whether it's through these 100-day semesters or whether it's through the 2-day woofas. NOLS has been changing people's lives for 50 years. And it's why we have to take such care that NOLS is here to do the same thing for the next 50. But there's an irony, because taking care does not mean we have to treat this like some precious object which can never be touched. Taking care means preserving the soul of NOLS. It means preserving these outcomes. But it also recognizes that if we want to be relevant, we have to recognize that we've got to figure out how to preserve the soul of NOLS into what is going to be a very different world. And anyway, just as the last 50 years have been tough, the next 50 are going to be tough too. It's going to require us to do things differently than we've done before. It's going to mean trying things that may not work the first time. Oh, great, thank you. Or at all. Is that on or off now?
You can just turn it off.
All right, good, perfect. You can hear me. Anyway, it's going to require doing things that are different, or that don't work, or that we try and fail time and time again. It's going to require flexibility, innovation, and just to a little bit, maybe even thinking like a startup. But I really believe that ultimately it requires all of us, in the classroom, in the field, in the branches, in the headquarters, and even on the board, to kind of recognize one imperative thing, which is that our limit can be a failure to think of things, but it can't be a lack of courage to try them. So thank you for letting me speak to you this morning, and thank you guys for all that you do for the school.